As many of you know, I grew up Catholic. One day in the spring of 1976, I brought home news to my mom from my Little League coach that we were going to have a practice next Sunday morning at 10 a.m. To which my mom replied, "That's nice, dear, you'll be in church." I believe the greatest gift that the Jewish people have given the world is not monotheism or Jerusalem or the Hebrew Scriptures or the Talmud. It is the concept of the Sabbath, the great day off, the idea of stepping off the treadmill of human commerce, human business, human building, human making, and human doing, and spending an entire day human being. The Talmud says the Sabbath is somewhat like the world to come, as it's often translated into English from the Hebrew, somewhat like eternity. Well, we can take this somewhat like eternity or somewhat like the world to come as meaning heaven and the afterlife, or we can take it as meaning the establishment of the beloved community, where we create a more paradise-like heaven on earth, a community of the world as it should be, of peace and justice. It works either way. The Sabbath is very flexible to fit your own philosophy. There are two different reasons given for the Sabbath in the Hebrew Scriptures. In Exodus and Leviticus, it's fairly similar. Exodus 20:8-11 says that the reason for the Sabbath is God rested on the seventh day following the work of creation. The text says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work. Neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your livestock, or the traveler who is within your gates. For in 6 days Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12-11, yes, your Unitarian preacher was quoting scripture to you this morning. Good stuff in here. The reason is God brought you out of slavery in the land of Egypt. The text says, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox or your donkey, or any of your animals, or any foreigner residing in your town." Immigrants. "They will rest as you do, for remember you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." The Jewish origin and practice of Sabbath is directly related to a slave revolution in Egypt. Immediately following the flight from Egypt in the Scriptures, you get the Sinai event and the giving of the law, including the 10 Commandments and the commandment to keep the Sabbath. "I am the Lord your God," it all begins, "who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me." And then the fourth commandment is noted as above in its different versions. "Keep the Sabbath day holy because God rested and because God brought you out of Egypt." In his book, Sabbath as Resistance, Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, Walter Brueggemann, ties these two reasons together. Rest on the Sabbath day is an act of revolution and an act of resistance against the economics of exploitation, which was then and basically is today what our practice of capitalism has become. Whether or not you believe in the Exodus story as a real-life historical event, or it's just a story, it's a story with very important themes and powerful messages. In its very origin, the keeping of the Sabbath is both spiritual and political. There is no disassociated spirituality in this world. The pharaohs of the world are political. And if the people are not, then eventually the people become the slaves of the pharaohs. The Sabbath, being a spiritual discipline, is a form of resistance to everything the pharaohs of the world stand for. Greed, acquisition, power, control, fear of want, anxiety that others will take what you have, self-centeredness, only the strong survive. Some people are better than other people. Rest on the Sabbath is an act of resistance against a political, economic, and cultural system based on a hierarchy of wealth and power that view the individual not as a human being, not as a citizen, but as an economic commodity and a depersonalized consumer of goods. There is no inherent worth and dignity in such a system. In his book, The Sabbath, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel writes, "When the Romans met the Jews and noticed their strict adherence to the law of abstaining from labor on the Sabbath, their only reaction was contempt. The Romans believed you achieved immortality by achieving great deeds, which were told after your death. So why take a day off when you could be achieving great deeds? That's one less day to accomplish great things." The Jewish people understood that immortality could not be bought, sold, or even achieved. It was lived out in the here and now, when we made living in the here and now somewhat like eternity. What good was it to be a great person if you were an evil great person? The kind of person you are counted. And it's one of the chief reasons why Sabbath was and continues to be so important. The Romans weren't alone in holding the notion of Sabbath in contempt. Our entire society holds the Sabbath in contempt. It is a Sabbath-condemning culture we live in. It is a badge of honor in our society to work long hours, to brag about how little sleep you can function on. People study how to multitask and do as many things possible as once. This is sick. This is a diseased way to live. We are perhaps the most overworked, over-consuming, unhealthy society, not only in the modern world, but perhaps ever. Our society values people not for their human qualities, but for purchasing power and productivity. In our society, poverty is considered a character flaw. That if you are poor, there is something wrong with you, who you are and what you are. When in reality, poverty is a politically constructed thing, constructed through the perpetuation of unjust systems. You know, our own church cannot even escape this in our history. The money that built this church, indeed most of Hopedale, the Draper fortune, which was indeed very benevolent and very good to this congregation and the town. Its wealth was basically dependent on the labor of African slaves. How can this be? The Hopedale community, when it started, was an abolitionist community, which is true. But when the Drapers started making their money, they made it making parts for industrial textile industry. An industry that was so profitable because of the raw materials of the textile industry being so cheap. Cotton. And that cotton came from the South, and it was inexpensive because of the labor of enslaved Africans. That is not to say the Drapers or their descendants were bad. They were good and very benevolent. And yet at the same time, we are caught in the system of the Pharaoh. That's part of our history together too. And what to do with that going on is our task. Not to say anything was in the past should have been different. They did what they did at the time. But we know now the system of the Pharaoh. And how do we keep the Sabbath going forward? Brueggemann argues that the God of Israel and its religion cannot even be known or understood apart from the intimate connection of Sabbath to the Exodus story. The God Israel worships is a God that rests and demands rest and restorative time for everyone. Notice in the text, everyone, the servants, the foreigners, the immigrants, the animals, all get to rest. Through all the law and the prophets, and I would even argue the New Testament text, they all must be read in this context of Sabbath and resistance. The great political struggle of our time is whether our government is concerned with business and profit, which is the technical definition of fascism, or with the needs of human beings. And this has been the justice struggle in the Judeo-Christian tradition since the beginning of that tradition. Brueggemann notes that the Pharaoh, and all pharaohs throughout history, they are always anxious about losing power, always anxious there will not be enough, so they hoard, even in times of plenty, even when others have next to nothing. Always in need of more money, more power, more control, more worship. The pharaohs of the world create such a world of anxiety that even we who are oppressed by them buy into their philosophy that we must have more, we must make more money, we must have more security, we must have more control, we must have more power. It's a dog-eat-dog world, survival of the fittest. And perhaps most importantly, we must worship the idol of individualism and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Sabbath is not an individual time. It is a time for family, friends, and neighbors and relationship building. Of all the great observances in the Jewish tradition, the one at its core, the most foundational, the Sabbath, does not happen in the synagogue or the temple. Its celebration happens at home. For the Sabbath at home, family, friends, and neighbors removes us from the world of the false idol of the individual and reminds us that we are social creatures, and we divorce ourselves from community, family, friends, and neighbors at great risk to ourselves and to the community. Not only is the Sabbath tied to the Exodus story, it is tied to all the other commandments, especially the commandment about not having idols. If one worships money and the acquisition of power and control over others, that is worshiping an idol, treating something that is not divine and sacred as if it were something divine and sacred, if not God itself. If we covet our neighbor's things, we are once again in the soul trap of valuing things and money and acquisition over people. We shouldn't covet and or steal anything from our neighbors. We should have a relationship with them where we share. Michael Fishbane, in his work on Jewish theology called Sacred Attunement, writes about the Sabbath and other Jewish practices, saying that they are designed to create Jewish mindfulness in a world of mindlessness. He argues that business and commerce are prohibited on the Sabbath because one is urged not just to desist from commerce, but also to develop more interior spheres of settling the mind from this type of agitation. Electricity and technology are discouraged for use on the Sabbath because, he says, the practical benefits of technology aside, one tries to stand in the cycle of natural time without manipulation or interference. I heard this on NPR yesterday, driving to buy bread, that Japanese researchers have found that even sitting for 10 minutes in the woods reduces stress hormones and blood pressure. That's what Sabbath is for. Sitting in the woods. away from your screen, perhaps with your family. Jesus in the New Testament asks, was the Sabbath made for people, or were people made for the Sabbath? In other words, one of the things we need to be careful of is making rules about Sabbath time so they prevent us from entering to Sabbath time. In order to achieve the practice of Sabbath, we must take on disciplines and practices in which we hold ourselves to account because we reap both short and long-term benefits from them, not because of some religious rule or because there is a commandment in an ancient text. You won't go to hell if you don't come to church or synagogue or mosque or temple. But if you don't attend regularly, neither will you reap any of the benefits from attending at all. The Sabbath must be careful not to be anti-oppressive in itself. Notice that the Sabbath requires accepting others, foreigners, visitors, immigrants. It requires taking care of widows and orphans and the poor. If we don't do these things, we never really leave the world of the Pharaoh. Now y'all may be thinking, well, this is all great, but we have to live in the real world. But that's the whole point. That's not the real world. The real world is the world of Sabbath, of relationship, of quiet, of family, of study, of reading, of sitting in the woods. That's the real world. We have all been brainwashed into thinking that the world of individualism, business, profit, consuming, the rat race, business, anxiety, not enough hours in the day, is the real world. It's not. Sabbath begs us to step out of the matrix, to resist, to unplug, to be a little revolutionary, to tell the world of economic exploitation to, well, take a hike. Heschel cast the Sabbath and the human struggle essentially as a battle between space and time. Heschel says that technical civilization is humanity's conquest of time. He says the danger begins when in gaining power in the realm of space, we forfeit aspiration in the realm of time. There is a realm of time where the goal is not to have but to be, not to own but to give, not to control but to share, not to subdue but to be in accord. Life goes wrong when the control of space and the acquisition of the things of space becomes our sole concern. So how do we recapture time? How do we work in the concept of Sabbath to the practice of Unitarian Universalism? What would a Unitarian Universalist Sabbath look like? How do we set aside time to be a little more like the world to come? Well, first it takes planning. It would take planning the way you plan for any special event, say Thanksgiving dinner. It would involve family and friends. Perhaps there'd be a chalice lighting to connect us to our heritage. Sabbath, for it to be effective for us, needs to happen on a regular basis. It needs to be something that we make a point to do over and over. Being a Unitarian Universalist means commitment to such things and holding ourselves to it. Not because we'll go to hell if we don't, but because of what it does for us. Being a Unitarian Universalist doesn't mean throwing away the ideas of our religion when they become inconvenient. That is stepping into the unreal world of the Pharaohs. Like any spiritual practice, Sabbath is not something we can just jump into and expect it to render results. I cannot start practicing tennis tomorrow and end up at Wimbledon later this spring. So we start small. Maybe a daily Sabbath, a little regular time out, 3 deep breaths, a 5-minute break of silence, a 10-minute walk or sitting in the woods. Perhaps just lighting our chalice and saying one of the prayers from church. Love is the spirit of our church. Maybe it's also the spirit of your life, your family. Maybe we can practice Sabbath a little more weekly when we get used to it. Church on Sunday morning and maybe nothing else scheduled to mid-afternoon. Or maybe one night a week. It doesn't have to be Friday. It could be any night of the week. Maybe each week, depending on your schedule, it's a different night each week. You have dinner with family or friends and light a chalice. And just hang out and talk. Maybe weekly Sabbath leads us to a monthly Sabbath practice. Join a group that meets for an unplugged activity. Join our chalice circle or another small group. Go hiking. Invite your neighbors over for a potluck once a month. Really get to know them. Volunteer at the community meal with us on the last Friday of each month. Or just go there to eat and hang out with us. Go to Laundry Love once a month. Join a bike riding group. Plan a monthly outing with family and friends. I'm sure that most of us do at least some of this stuff already. Maybe what we need to concentrate on is making it such a regular thing for ourselves and connecting its importance, being Sabbath time, to all the good it does for ourselves and to us being Unitarian Universalists. Have you ever spent time over coffee with a friend? Had a family dinner, engaged in meditation, looked at the sunset over Hopedale Pond, read a book, looked up at the stars in wonder, and time just seemed to stop? Perhaps it was somewhat like eternity in that moment. Between now and eternity, don't you think you deserve a day off? That's what the Sabbath asks you to do. And that is something we create when we observe Sabbath time. We carve out time to be with ourselves and each other, as if it's the most single important thing of our week, the way the Sabbath anchors Jewish practice. Maybe, instead of being just an important thing in our day or week, maybe, just maybe, it will seem like a little bit of eternity each time. Just like the world to come, like living in the beloved community, made real here and now. And that, my friends, is just as revolutionary an act today as it was when those slaves walked out of Egypt.